Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome back to Rocky Mountain Readings, where yesterday we finished off the wonderful book, Rabbi Akiva, Sage of the Talmud. And I thought, okay, maybe I will continue with this biographical theme. And today I selected to start Providence and Power, 10 Portraits in Jewish Statesmanship by Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. It looks like it's a wonderful book showing 10 different characters of Jewish statesmanship, which is in line with the biographical theme we've been going through with Rabbi Akiva, and I think it should be another interesting read. Perhaps we can find out some grand ideas about the character of certain individuals. And so, yeah, let's just jump right into it. All right, so we're in the introduction. David, king of Israel, lives and endures. This Talmudic maxim, pronounced by adults with reverence, put to music, and sung by children at a young age, has helped to keep alive the memory and the lasting impact of a man who died millennia ago. Yeah, roughly more than 3 millennia ago. In the minds and hearts of Jews around the world, and perhaps especially in the capital city of Jerusalem that he created. The spirit of that monarch, the subject of this book's first chapter, does indeed live on, making him, along with Abraham and Moses, one of the most revered figures in Jewish history. To say that the biblical David still lives and endures is also to say that David's brand of Jewish statesmanship, joining political genius with ardent faith, profoundly matters, fully as much today as in the 10th century BC. This renders it all the more striking, so that few studies of Jewish statesmanship exist. To be sure, writings about statecraft itself have long been a staple of Western literature, and some of the best-known examples of the genre are rightly honored as seminal works of political philosophy. The same can be said for works focusing on individual leaders, from the writings of Thucydides on Pericles in ancient Greece to, in the modern period, Winston Churchill's meditations on the Duke of Marlborough, or Henry Kissinger on Clemens von Metternich. All reflect the justified conviction that history's most influential actors have enduring lessons to impart concerning the character of political leadership. Modern Jewish scholars and thinkers have assuredly been among those contributing to the study of the subject of statesmanship in general. Few, however, have turned their attention to the history of Jewish leaders in particular. That is, leaders specifically of the Jewish people, as distinct from Jews who have risen to greatness in service to non-Jewish regimes or causes. Nor is this lacuna a recent phenomenon. In the brimmingly ample corpus of learned texts compiled by or about Jews over the millennia, it is difficult to point to studies whose central concern has been either with the particular nature of Jewish statecraft, again in this book distinct use of the term, or with outstanding exemplars of that calling. One may be tempted to attribute this seeming neglect to the relative lack of practitioners of Jewish statecraft, either during the biblical period of the sovereignty in the Holy Land and of sovereignty once again in present-day Israel, or during the millennia of exile and formal Jewish statelessness. Indeed, one might have conjectured that precisely because Jews lacked a landed existence for so many centuries, true examples of statesmanship were simply not to be found in the exilic era, a time when Jews enjoyed neither a national independence nor the national power so manifestly present in the life of King David. That, however, would be a mistake. Statecraft, at its essence, the marshaling and application of available power on behalf of one's people, and also in the Jewish case, the representation of one's people before the powerful. During those stateless millennia, it was often precisely the challenges of life in dispersion and subjugation that gave rise to some of the most compelling embodiments of Jewish statesmanship on the part of figures who refused to give up on the Jews as a people and who acted in the political realm to safeguard their posterity. This returns us to our enterprise here in Providence and Power. The entire biblical book of Esther, the subject of our second chapter, can be read precisely as a meditation on the nature of Jewish leadership in the exilic age immediately following the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Unveiled in this text are the remarkable political instincts that, driven by the young queen's conviction of having been placed by Providence in a position to act on behalf of a nation dispersed, but a nation still, will enable her to save her people from annihilation. As her cousin Mordecai pointedly reminds Esther at one critical juncture, perhaps you have arisen to the throne for just such a moment. In later generations, the specifically political aspects of Esther's life have often gone unappreciated, but her person has nonetheless been celebrated every year on the Jewish holiday of Purim. The same, sadly, cannot be said for Shlomzion, the queen of the Second Temple Judea, whom we meet in our third chapter. That so few today know anything about her shows how even a leader in a period of Jewish independence can remain unstudied and unsung. Like Esther, who survives the court of manic Persian king and his rabidly anti-Semitic vizier. Shlomzion makes her own gifts manifest amid the mayhem in fratricidal court of the latter-day Hasmonean circa 100 BC. In rising to the throne and in working alongside the spiritual leader, Shimon ben Shattah, she is able to seize and to redeem the last interval of Jerusalem's independence before the arrival of the Romans, by whom in 70 CE Jerusalem will be destroyed once again. And even with that destruction, Jewish statesmanship did not disappear. The heritage of Shlomzion and Shimon ben Shattah would live on in the actions of Yochanan ben Zakkai, the heroic savior of rabbinic Judaism, and the focal figure of chapter 4. Although he did not devote his life specifically to politics, his legacy is bound up with two defining political moments: his own dawning realization that the city of Jerusalem was doomed to destruction at the hands of the Romans, and his consequent initiative in successfully ensuring a haven for Jewish continuity outside of the Judean capital. This profound political and strategic response to the second devastating conquest of Judea's capital is a study in formidable and heartbreaking decisions forced upon a Jewish leader at a time of extreme crisis, requiring a series of tragic sacrifices in an against all odds gamble to preserve the Jewish future. Moving on, other stirring exemplars of statesmanship in the exilic history of the Jewish people include in chapter 5 Isaac Abravanel from 1437 to 1508, a 15th century Sephardi sage who combines his role as a scholar and religious leader with high service, also on behalf of his people to the government of Spain, Portugal, and Venice, in a way not seen in Judaism for some time. The Abravanel joins a subtly masterful understanding of real politic to faith in God's providential care for his people. A century and a half later, in a similar vein, Manasseh ben Israel from 1604 to 1657 in chapter 6, another Sephardi rabbi, will seize the freedom provided by the Dutch Republic to lobby Oliver Cromwell for the readmission of Jews to England, from where the entire Jewish population had been banished in 1290. In an especially poignant example of the workings of politics and providence, Manasseh dies convinced of his failure to make use of his own providential moment in history. In fact, as our retrospective study demonstrates, his example is nothing short of inspirational. In the 18th and 19th centuries, with the dawning of the Age of Enlightenment, and increasingly for West European Jews, civic emancipation and enfranchisement, another fascinating form of Jewish statesmanship emerges. Some individuals, including descendants of those who had been cut off from the Jewish faith or who had cut themselves off, arise to speak on behalf not only of Jewish civil rights, but also of Jewish national restoration. One of them, whom we encounter in chapter 7, is Benjamin Disraeli from 1804 to 1881, baptized at the age of 12 by his father, who has regarded his own Jewish heritage with utter scorn. The younger Disraeli becomes so entranced with the role played by his ancestral people in history and by the refusal of that people to succumb and disappear that he is driven, perhaps against his own political self-interest, to place his Jewishness at the heart of his political persona. As a matchless British politician and as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he will argue in his writings and public statements that a Jewish reclaiming of the Holy Land is yet to come. Disraeli's presence will soon be confirmed in the rise of another public Jew, an assimilated Austrian journalist, lawyer, and activist named Theodor Herzl from 1860 to 1904 in Chapter 8. The latter's own transformation from alienated skeptic into the founder of modern political Zionism is so unlikely that only Providence may seem to offer a coherent explanation for all that he accomplishes, all that he sets in motion, and all that he inspires. No less likely is the trajectory tracked in Chapter 9 of another assimilated Jew, the American jurist Louis D. Brandeis from 1856 to 1941. From publicly militating against any self-identification of American Jews with specifically Jewish causes, this Associate Justice of the Supreme Court and confidant of President Woodrow Wilson will go on to play a critical role, some say the critical role, in Britain's announcement in 1917 of the Balfour Declaration, endorsing the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home, the first major achievement of the Zionist movement following the death of Theodor Herzl. By the mid-20th century, finally, a number of modern Jewish leaders, even as they dedicate themselves to the refounding of the sovereign Jewish state, itself is one of the greatest political feats in human history, will look back for inspiration and a sense of fellowship to the outstanding figures of the past. We meet two of the most outstanding such figures in Chapter 10. They have much in common and profound differences as well. David Ben-Gurion, who lived between 1886 and 1973, founder and first prime minister of the State of Israel, will make the decision that proved critical for the new nation's birth and survival. His statecraft, as we shall see, is markedly inspired by the Hebrew Bible and by his personal admiration for the leaders described in it. By contrast, his somewhat younger political rival, Menachem Begin, 1913 to 1992, Prime Minister from 1977 to 1983, will constantly remind his fellow Israelis that their national inspiration must be drawn not only from the heroes of the Bible age, but also from the centuries of Jewish leaders and believers who followed. A covenantal connection to the past that is manifest in every aspect of Begin's own life and leadership. As I will argue in the book's final chapter, I believe that Menachem Begin is the ultimate embodiment of Jewish statesmanship in our time, not because he played the most critical role in Israel's birth, that honor goes to Ben-Gurion, but because he embodied the fusion of faith and fortitude, the embrace of both providence and power, once personified by David, king of Israel. What can be said about Ben-Gurion and Begin can be said about all of the figures in these pages. They have certain features in common, and some features that make them profoundly and intriguingly distinctive. As the book will describe, many of them, like Begin, place traditional faith at the heart of their statesmanship, from the biblical examples of David and Esther to Manasseh ben Israel. Others, including Disraeli and Brandeis, had, like Ben-Gurion, a more complicated relationship with Jewish religious tradition. But guiding the efforts of all, whether in the ancient or modern periods of sovereignty or in the centuries of exile in between, is the fixed lodestar of their own Jewish identity and the high compelling duty of service to the well-being of the Jewish people. Interesting. This volume, which originated in a series of lectures for the Tekiva Fund, is devoted to some of the most fascinating and consequential Jewish political leaders over the past 3 millennia. In studying the unique challenges faced by these leaders and the characteristics that mark them as Jewish statesmen, bearers, that is, of a highly particular history, heritage, and identity, we also examine what Jewish tradition has to say about the demands of statescraft itself, and by inference about the qualities needed by successful Jewish political leaders encountering the challenges of today and tomorrow. Pondering the relative lack of biographies of seminal Jewish figures, the late Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein once ruefully remarked that our Johnsons have no Boswells. He was referring to the 18th century English literary genius Samuel Johnson and to James Boswell, Johnson's faithful companion and biographer. Indeed, too many of the greatest Jewish political figures have had no Boswells, but that only increases the importance of efforts like ours to understand the lives they lived and how they led. We have no higher duty, the political philosopher Leo Strauss admonished his students immediately after the death of Winston Churchill, than to remind ourselves and our students of political greatness, human greatness, of the peaks of human excellence. It is my hope that this book will make its own contribution to understanding the political and human greatness of the Jewish past and to helping ensure this people's future. Wow, sounds like an interesting read for sure. All right, so chapter 1 is on King David. Hopefully you guys will enjoy this. I know it's new to me, so yeah. It is a peculiar fact that from medieval times until today, the elaborate rituals attending the coronation ceremonies of English kings have owed a great deal to the Hebrew Bible, and specifically to the Bible's description of the coronations of King David and his dynastic successors. Even more peculiar, perhaps, is that in all this time not a single English monarch has been known by the name of David. The one partial exception to the rule was the uncle of Queen Elizabeth, baptized Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. He was known to his closest friends as David, but upon attaining the throne in January 1936, immediately took the regal name of Edward VIII, before abdicating the throne altogether by December of the same year. Evidently, then, David, for the British, has been no name for a king. The Scots have evinced a somewhat greater liking for it, and yet, for Jews, there is and there can be no better name for a king, for no other individual has been so eternally affiliated with the very idea of Jewish monarchy. That David is thought of as the political ruler par excellence can be seen in the perennial Jewish practice of referring to him always with his honorific as David Hamelech, David the King, as if to say David the King, just as Abraham for the Jews is always Abraham Avinu, Abraham our father, indicating his status as the supreme symbol of the Jewish family, and Moses is Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our master, confirming him as the supreme teacher of the Jewish faith. David Hamelech reigns supreme in the annals of Jewish statesmanship. Indeed, if we wish to learn about statesmanship from a Jewish perspective, we must turn first and foremost to his life and legend. And what a legendary figure he was, veritably from the start. As a mere stripling, he was propelled to fame through his one-on-one victory over the notoriously invincible Goliath. Therefore, adopted by King Saul as a favored ward, only to be soon targeted as a potential rival to the throne. David gained further acclaim by surmounting a series of near calamities and ultimately succeeding Saul on the throne. Upon being crowned, he proceeded to solidify his reputation for military brilliance by enlarging the territory of his monarchy and seizing control of the city of Jerusalem, which for centuries had been considered impregnable. Late in life, he would bequeath to the next generation the task of realizing his vision of a grand temple to God in the capital city. So quintessentially regal is David in the Jewish imagination, so synonymous with both monarchical magnificence and uniquely exemplary statesmanship, that millions of Jewish children today are familiar as their elders with the 5 auditory words of the beloved tune, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayem. David, King of Israel, lives and endures. But herein, on reflection, lies a great enigma. If Abraham is always Avinu, our father, because his family has endured, and Moses is always Rabbeinu, our master, because his teachings have endured, in what sense, if any, can it be said that David is always perpetually king of Israel? True, his son Solomon did build the temple about which his father had dreamed, but after Solomon's death, 10 of the 12 tribes seceded from Israel, or from the kingdom, for the next several centuries. David's dynasty ruled over southern Israel alone. After the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylonia in 586, no descendant of David would again sit upon the throne of Israel. The Jewish monarchy, when it did rule, was instead led by the priestly Hasmonean house. In later centuries, before disappearing altogether, the Davidic dynasty survived only in certain lesser offices established by rabbinic authority, like patriarch in the Holy Land and exilarch in the diaspora. As a ruling royal family, the house of David endured only in the form of a messianic hope. What then does it mean to declare that David, king of Israel, lives? To address that question, we need to define not only the generally accepted elements that constitute a true statesman, but also, more particularly, what it means to speak of excellence in Jewish statesmanship. As for the first, we can begin by distinguishing the statesman from another indispensable type of public servant, namely the administrator or bureaucrat. The latter, all rules and regulations, excels in the analysis and management of what is; the former, all personality, impress with his or her vision of what has come before and what is yet to be. If at their best, administrators achieve by meeting or exceeding the demands that are put upon them. The achievement of a statesman, extensions of their unique creative capacities, are measured by their ability to lead and inspire. This point was made by the late British political philosopher Isaiah Berlin in his essay on political judgment in 1996. We tend to speak about political science, Berlin wrote, as if affairs of state obeyed universal rules. But truly, great leaders decide what to do by drawing on a strength within themselves. Political judgment, in Berlin's words, is a capacity, in the first place, for synthesis rather than analysis, for knowledge in the sense in which conductors know their orchestra as opposed to that which chemists know the contents of their test tubes, or mathematicians know the rules that their symbols obey. Great leadership, in other words, reveals the inner genius of the leader and is an art rather than a science. Makes sense. That is, no doubt, what the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, as the convener of the Sixth Power 1878 Congress of Berlin, had in mind when he exclaimed admiringly of one participant, British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Der alte Jude, das ist der Mann. The old Jew, he is the man. What, then, of statesmanship from the unique perspective of Judaism? Innate political genius is certainly part of it. But at the heart of the Jewish perspective lies another, wholly different claim about the sources of great political achievement undertaken and on behalf of the Jewish people. Political instinct is essential, but something remains that cannot be chalked up to the choices made by leaders. According to this, Jewish success and Jewish endurance are to be seen also as the result of divine providence. It is that which ensures the eternal wonder known as Jewish chosenness. This lies an extraordinary burden on the Jewish statesman at his or her most excellent. The burden of at once exemplifying the artistry that burns within, while simultaneously and gracefully acknowledging what is owed to the God of Israel, who reveals himself precisely and most fully in the history of the Jewish people. The very history that the great Jewish statesman is charged to move forward. This complex, delicate dialectic was given eloquent expression by the American Jewish intellectual Milton Himmelfarb, responding to Israel's astonishingly swift and sweeping victory on the June 1967 Six-Day War. Himmelfarb wrote, "Each Jew knows how ordinary he is. Yet, taken together, we seem caught up in the things great and inexplicable. It is almost as if we are not acting, but being acted through. The number of Jews in the world is smaller than the small statistical error in the Chinese census. Yet we remain bigger than our numbers. Big things seem to happen around us and to us." From one perspective, the 1967 war witnessed the ultimate epitome of Jewish and specifically Israeli military genius. A preemptive strike that disabled the entire Egyptian Air Force, followed by one of the most extraordinary ground campaigns in the history of warfare. And yet, Himmelfarb understood that the Jews who brought about these wondrous victories needed to be seen not only as actors, which they most certainly were, but also as providentially acted upon. May we see that again in our day. Their spectacular achievement, redolent of one small people's record of repeatedly outliving its much larger and more powerful enemies, was a triumph of human will and of human initiative, and it was also a miracle. To adopt a Jewish approach to statesmanship is thus to embrace this dialectic. On the one hand, great statesmen, to paraphrase Isaiah Berlin, conduct history on the way maestros conduct their orchestras, and for Judaism this is a talent to be admired. On the other hand, appreciation of this talent must be combined with the recognition that there is someone who is the true conductor. It is in this religious and political perspective that David, more than anyone else in the Bible, embodies and reflects. At his moments of greatest genius, when he might have been expected to claim all credit for himself, he instead insistently, single-mindedly, and with matchless eloquence, ascribes his success to the almighty, salvific love for his people. What is more, David exhibits this trait from the very beginning in the youthful battleground feat that sparked his rise to greatness. Picture the scene. The Philistines gather their forces led by their champion, the gargantuan Goliath. Saul seeks someone to face him. David, superficially a retiring lad, a mere shepherd boy, steps forward, spoiling for a fight. Saul's voice skepticism, but David defiantly replies that he has already bested many an adversary. Thy servant, he says of himself to the king, kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine, Goliath, shall be as one of them. If this makes David seem an arrogant, overconfident braggart, there is still more to come. He would also have Saul and us understand that his entire approach to combat rests on an extraordinary premise. The God who saved me from the lion and the bear will save me from the Philistine, for he has besmirched the forces of the living God. Next, in confronting Goliath in the field, the intrepid David repeats the message. Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. With that, and with one shot from his sling, David downs the giant. This moment, his stand against Goliath, is a microcosm of David's greatness and a prism through which to study his entire career. In essence, however, it is easily misunderstood. The journalist Malcolm Gladwell, for instance, in a celebrated book-length treatment of David and Goliath, 2013, insists that the central lesson of the story is that any gifted strategist can turn disadvantage into advantage. David's victory over Goliath in the biblical account is held to be an anomaly. It was not. David wins all the time. Citing political science research to back up this sweeping claim, Gladwell then analyzes step by step the strategy that he sees David deploying. By eschewing body protection, David was able to act with a speed and quickness that Goliath, weighed down by heavy armor, could not match. Next, choosing a sling as his weapon enabled David to target his opponent's forehead, the one part of his body that was unarmored. Acting in unexpected and idiosyncratic ways, using speed to confuse, zeroing in on his opponent's weaknesses, it all adds up. In David's stand against Goliath, we see the making of a military genius, a crafty and conventional strategist who is equipped to emerge a winner not only once but throughout his life. Gladwell is partly right. David does employ his remarkable mental and physical agility in order to achieve victory, and in the genius of this young man, we do see the making of a future monarch. Indeed, nowhere does the Bible say anything to the contrary or imply that David's victory was an anomaly. But to stress this is to miss the whole point. For again, just when the temptation is strongest to ascribe to himself his gifts of courage and daring, David squarely places their source elsewhere. The God who saved me from the lion and the bear will save me from the Philistine. For he has besmirched the forces of the living God. David's faith is the true anomaly. I once asked a historian, Andrew Roberts, the author of the most recently of magisterial biography of Winston Churchill, whether any great European statesmen were known for their humility. He did not name a single one. For most, indeed, it is precisely the celebration of themselves, the delight in being in charge, that has been the source of their strength. In his own memoirs, Churchill describes his state of mind upon finally being appointed Prime Minister by King George VI. At this most daunting moment in English history, with France failing, the Nazis sweeping the continent, and neither America nor the Soviet Union yet in the battle against Hitler, Churchill writes, "I cannot conceal from the reader my profound sense of relief. At last I had the authority to give directions over the whole scene. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. I was sure I should not fail, and therefore, although impatient for the morning, I slept soundly and had no need for cheering dreams." The reader of Churchill's memoir is immediately struck by his sense of confidence, a character trait shared by David as well, but one would never call it humble. Churchill did indeed believe in destiny and in God, but in the Churchillian theology, as Andrew Robert puts it, God's job seemed to consist mainly in safeguarding the well-being of Winston Churchill. We do begrudge Churchill's his self-confidence, his delight in being in control, his seeming belief that by force of will alone he could yet win the war. In fact, Churchill's example never ceased to inspire. His confidence in himself is what allowed him to act as a bulwark in the face of the impotence of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and much of the free world in their encounter with Hitler. Churchill was a great man, and he knew it. David, however, is another matter. In becoming king, in defending Israel against its enemies, in helping to form his nation into a regional superpower, he too, like Churchill, in his memoirs, again and again offers us a window into his mind. But how different that mind is. To discover it, we need only consult the biblical book of Psalms, so many of whose individual poems are linked to his name and or attributed to his authorship. Here are three brief examples taken selectively from Psalm 18, which bears the caption of David, the servant of the Lord. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower. That's verse 18, verse 3. For thou wilt save the afflicted people, for by thee I have run through a troop, and by my God have I leaped over a wall. 18, verse 28 and 30. It is God that girdeth me with strength, and maketh my way perfect. 18, verse 33. In this Psalm's lengthy description of his battles, his victory, his military exploits, and his fantastic feats, is David's subject or object. The very theme of the psalm is the vital interrelation of the two. Just as the well-being of the Jewish people is in his hands, both he and they are in the hands of God. Is he a great warrior statesman or a humble servant? He is both. He attacks a troop of enemies, runs through them, leaps a wall, but thou, he proclaims, wilt save the afflicted people. In his statesmanship, he sees no celebration of the self, but an understanding by Israel and the world of the miracle that is Israel. 3 millennia later, that same understanding would lie deep in the soul of Nathan Sharansky, a hero of our own time. In his memoir, Fear No Evil, 1988, about the 9 years he spent in Soviet prisons for the crime of activism on behalf of Jews like himself who aspired to leave the Soviet Union, he writes that the only Jewish image in his secular childhood home had been of David defeating Goliath. Now, in the confinement of a remote prison camp in the Siberian Gulag, he drew solace and confidence from poring over the small book of Psalms given to him lovingly by his wife Avital, and learning for himself through the personality of the author to fear no evil from Psalm 23. King David, Sharansky writes, had come to his aid not as a fabled hero or a mystical Superman, but as a live, indomitable soul. He was daring and resolute, but in order to be bold in combat with his enemies, he had to be humble before the Lord. We began following Isaiah Berlin by distinguishing the gifts of statesmen from those of administrators. But surely there must be a way to discriminate among statesmen themselves, or so thought a much younger Isaiah Berlin. In the book called The Hedgehog and the Fox from 1953, an earlier book-length essay that became perhaps his most famous work, Berlin took his cue from the ancient Greek, saying that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing, and divided all statesmen and leaders, as well as all writers and thinkers, in two disparate categories: those who, like foxes, respond diversely to diverse situations, and those who, like hedgehogs, relate everything to a single central vision. Not everybody has agreed with this bifurcation. As the Yale military historian John Lewis Gaddis has summed up, Berlin seemed to be saying that you had to be one or the other. You couldn't be both and be happy, or effective, or even whole. But Gaddis asserts Berlin was wrong. Truly great statesmen are simultaneously hedgehogs and foxes, combining a compelling moral vision with the craftiness required to address challenges to the vision. In his 2018 book on grand strategy, Gaddis adduces the cinematic example of the 2012 Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, wherein the president tells the impassioned anti-slavery advocate Thaddeus Stevens that while Lincoln, also opposes slavery, unlike Stevens, he possesses the political skill to maneuver towards actually abolishing the institution. To illustrate, Lincoln invokes a lesson he learned while working as a surveyor. A compass will point you true north from where you're standing, but it's not going to advise you about the swamps and deserts and chasms that you'll encounter along the way. If in pursuit of your destination you plunge ahead, heedless of heedless of obstacles and achieve nothing more than to sink in a swamp, then what's the use of knowing true north? Pretty decent logic. As a hedgehog, Lincoln's true north was the proposition that all men are created equal. As a fox, he seized his moments, one in 1862 after the Union victory at Antietam, was to press forward with the Emancipation Proclamation. Another, after re-election 2 years later, was to engineer passage of the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. David, too, was a fox, and one whose creativity and political inventiveness never ceased to astonish. Facing Goliath, he devised the one strategy that will turn his opponent's tremendous size into a weakness, fleeing the wrath of Saul with his only option to take refuge among the Philistine enemies of Israel. He feigns madness so as not to be seen as a threat in his establishment of a capital city, as we shall see. He shows especially a far-sighted genius. A crafty fox he was, but he was also, if you will, a holy hedgehog, one whose faith in providence, whose trust in God's special providence for the Jewish people, and whose dread of losing the favor of that providence formed the foundation of his very existence. That is why we see David's true greatness not in victory but in defeat, most dramatically in the sinful episode of his relations with Bathsheba. He is informed by God that as punishment a rebellion will arise against him from his own household. And indeed, David's son Absalom soon chases his father from Jerusalem. As David descends in disgrace, he encounters a man named Shimei from the house of Saul, who curses him as a usurper. The king's men desire to kill Shimei, but David says no. Later, when he returns to power, Shimei begs forgiveness, and again one of David's company wants to kill him, and again David says no. He is fully taken in that what has befallen him is due to his own sin, and that his humiliations are themselves providential by definition. This is not to say that David had lost his more aggressive and cunning political instincts. Years later, on his deathbed, even as he willingly continues to accept his own ordained punishment, and as his faith in God's justice is unwavering, he warns his son Solomon to remove the threat that Shimei poses to their family's future. If the test of a first-rate intelligence, in F. Scott Fitzgerald's much-quoted formulation, is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function, the highly functioning David, for whom the opposed ideas were human agency and divine providence, feels himself at once subject and object, actor and acted upon. He plays the political and strategic equivalent of three-dimensional chess while remaining in his mind a pawn in the design of the Almighty, and knowing the latter for the privilege it is. Strategy, politics, military maneuvers, these are indispensable, making manifest the chosenness of Israel in history. This is the true north. Which finally brings us to David's relationship with Jerusalem, a relationship that reveals the essence of his greatness as a thinker, as tactical commander, and as a man of faith. Because that city, long held by the Canaanite tribe of the Jebusites, rested on a mountain surrounded by two valleys, it was known by all to be utterly unconquerable. But just as he had done with Goliath, David sought the overlooked point of vulnerability. The biblical narrative hints that the water source of the city, referred to in Hebrew as the Tzinor, was the one opening in its fortification through which David's warriors could strike and win the day, and so they did. Even more important than the strategic insight that facilitated this capstone military success was the political vision that animated it. David had been crowned king in Hebron, deep inside the territory of Judah, the tribe to which he belonged. His reason for moving the throne to Jerusalem was that, according to the book of Joshua, chapter 18, The city had been apportioned by God through Moses to not one but two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Thus, the Judahite David, who had displaced the Benjaminite Saul, would create a capital city through which to unify all Israel. Nor was that the sum and substance of his vision. After uniting Israel in and through Jerusalem, David, the military genius and far-seeing statesman, sought to crown the city's highest point, not with a royal palace, but with a temple. Yeah, what do you do if you've got that? Yeah, think about it. A dwelling place of the divine that would remind his people of the true source of their salvation. Here a complication enters the picture. Had David concluded his career by realizing his dream and actually building the edifice in the city he had conquered, it would inevitably come to be seen as a monument to himself and his own might rather than what it was intended to be, a tribute to God's role in the Jewish story. It is precisely for this reason the Bible suggests that the task of building the temple was taken from David and given ultimately to his son Solomon. Jerusalem, through Solomon, would now be identified first and foremost with that temple as the symbol of God's role in the Jewish history, David's true north. As we saw earlier on, David's descendants did not reign forever, but more than any other political leader in Jewish history, he has influenced the way that innumerable Jews have seen and measured themselves. Without Abraham, there would be no Jewish family. Without Moses, there would be no Jewish faith. But it was David's ability to inspire his people, to remind them of how God makes his miracles manifest in Jewish history, and how Jerusalem forever encapsulates this profound truth. That explains how Jews, dispersed all over the earth, would never stop thinking of themselves as one people, and never abandon the belief that they would one day return to Jerusalem. Wow. And you're thinking somebody from 3,000 years ago foresaw. And they return as they did in early May 1948, in a manifestation of the brilliant Jewish statesman that had brought the Jews to this moment. David Ben-Gurion rose to declare the sovereign independence of the Jewish state of Israel. Was this only a matter of statesmanship? One might well have thought so upon hearing or reading the Declaration of Independence itself. For in a concession to militant secular Marxists among the Zionist leadership, that document made no mention of the divine. But then, almost 20 years later, over the course of 6 short days in June 1967, Israel would confront and defeat a massive combined assault against it in a series of astonishing military maneuvers worthy of David himself. And something changed. The change is vividly registered in a photograph that has subsequently become one of the best known and most treasured images in Jewish history. The scene is the western wall of the ancient temple in Jerusalem. There at the locus of David's dream, jubilant Israeli soldiers, having just helped to wrest the old city from the grip of Jordanian forces, have gathered. Also present is the veteran Israeli photographer David Rubinger, who snaps a picture of, in particular, 3 exhausted paratroopers standing closely side by side at the wall. Of the 3 young men, one happens to be Ashkenazi, one Sephardi, and one Yemenite, a modern-day personification of the Jewish unity transcending diversity that David had fostered and founded in this self-same city thousands of years earlier. Most evocative of all is the awestruck face of the central figure, Yitzhak Yafat by name, caught by the camera as he looks up wistfully and seemingly longingly toward the Temple Mount. To the Israeli writer Yossi Klein Halevi, the powerful emotional impact exerted by this image and so many Jews around the world also signals a profound moment in the story of Zionism, the return not only of Jewish identity, but of the Jewish God. Judaism, he continues, posited a daring idea. that God's power and goodness would be revealed not only in the majesty of nature, but in the messiness of history. And even more improbably, in Jewish history. History had now yielded the moment of consolation that generations of believing Jews had insisted, against all logic, must come the reverence that many Jews felt towards the photograph of the paratroopers that was the stunned realization, seemingly reflected in Yitzhak Yifat's upturned face, that skeptical secularism may not be an adequate way of understanding the Jewish story, that God may be real after all. On a visit to the famed photographer's home decades later, Klein Halevi aired his interpretation of the image's potent allure. At first, Rubinger himself, a thoroughly secular Jew, disagreed. But then, as his guests would subsequently write about their meeting, Rubinger looked up at the photograph, which was hanging on his living room wall, and for a moment it seemed as if his upturned face merged with those of the paratroopers. Yes, he acknowledged there is humility in their faces. He was silent. When the state was created in 1948, he said after a while, we secular Jews felt no sense of God at all. But here there was something. This photo remains beloved in Jewish hearts because it best epitomizes the grand vision of the man and monarch named David. With its intertwined intricacies of peoplehood and politics, human initiative and divine providence, the centrality of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, and the belief that God, as Klein Halevi puts it, would be revealed in the messiness of Jewish history. That belief for so many is what was himself or confirmed and fulfilled when, to paraphrase the young shepherd who presented himself to Saul long ago, the God who saved David from the lion and the bear, however seemingly silent in recent decades past, suddenly made himself known in Jewish history once again. We do not always feel God's presence as David did, but the photograph's fame suggests that many Jews, deep down in the recesses of their souls, do still long to see a world infused by that presence. That is why, millennia after he reigned in Jerusalem, David still reigns in Jewish hearts, and why today Jews proudly proclaim that this King of Israel lives and endures, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayem. Wow. Profound, yes, when you think about it. So I hope that gives you a texture for what we'll be reading about statesmanship, character, integrity. What do you hinge your life upon? And sometimes people don't realize that it's the adversities of life that we've got to raise our desires above. And what is your desire? If it's met with that obstacle, you've got to lift that desire to shatter that obstacle. Yet the wicked always claim circumstance. Oh, because of the circumstance, I'm justified, as if I did it. They negate the social contract of the bond between family or community or nationality by discharging any responsibility to that community and say, oh, because of this circumstance, when it's an excuse rather than, in fact, tapping into the who they really are and rising above the circumstance. Yet, life can be harsh, but that's because of the greatness Hashem has placed within you to rise above it. And we don't want to make the world a darker place. You want to make it a better place so that people are inspired. In King David's life, you could see the way he's written this inspirational attitude. So, I'm sure we'll be hearing more of this. Chapter 2, Esther. I don't know if we'll finish this chapter, but I don't want it's too early to stop today. So let's continue. October 2021 marked the 75th anniversary of the execution of Nazi war criminals who had been convicted and sentenced to death by the post-war Allied Tribunal at Nuremberg. The trials themselves have rightly been lauded for the dignified air of the proceedings, for the presiding court's circumspect application of international law, and for sentencing decisions arrived at in sober prudence and representing a model of justice at its most just. Julius Streicher, the notorious Nazi propagandist and publisher of the virulently anti-Semitic weekly newspaper Der Stürmer, was among those on trial at Nuremberg, and unlike others of the accused, was neither silent nor in the least repentant. During the trial itself, he frequently interrupted to hurl lurid diatribes against Jews and against members of the tribunal themselves. Nor when taken out to be hanged on October 16, 1946, did he die with dignity. As Newsweek reported at the time, he had to be pushed across the floor, wild-eyed and screaming Heil Hitler. Mounting the steps, he cried out, "And now I go to God." He stared at the witnesses facing the gallows and shouted, "Purimfest 1946. Purimfest, surely an obscure utterance on which to end one's life, but not really, as a reference to the Jewish holiday of Purim, marked each year by the reading of the biblical book of Esther. It conjures up images familiar not only to Jews but also to their enemies. By invoking Purim, moreover, this arch-anti-Semite was drawing on a theme with a long German pedigree. According to that rendition, a holiday beloved of Jews, commemorating as it does their ancestors' last-minute rescue from the genocidal plans of the Persian vizier Haman, actually exposes the Jews themselves as bloodthirsty villains of the peace. For centuries before Julius Streicher, Martin Luther himself, an outspoken anti-Semite, put the case succinctly. The Jews, he wrote, are real liars and bloodhounds who have not only continually perverted and falsified all of Scripture with their mendacious glosses from the beginning until the present day. Their hearts' most ardent sighing and yearning and hoping is set on the day in which they can deal with us Gentiles as they did with the Gentiles in Persia at the time of Esther. Oh, how fond they are of the book of Esther, which is so beautifully attuned to their bloodthirsty, vengeful, murderous yearning and hope. Wow, that was written by Martin Luther. For Streicher, then, the death penalty delivered at Nuremberg and his imminent execution by hanging meant one thing and only one thing, and one thing only. As in Persia long ago, so at Nuremberg, the vengeful and murderous Jews were having their vengeance. Luther, in the midst of his own malignant assaults on Jews and the Jewish faith, was right about one thing. Jews are indeed fond of the biblical book of Esther. They love and revere the woman, the queen, the leader, for whom the book is named, and whose heroism brought about the downfall of the evil Haman and his 10 complicit sons, thereby saving the Jews of Persia from being wiped out. And Streicher was also on the mark, though in a way opposite to what he intended, for his own hero Adolf Hitler was indeed a modern-day Haman, and the Nazi criminals on trial at Nuremberg were Hitler's spiritual sons. In still a further parallel, Esther's Persia was akin to the Germany of Streicher's day, a great center of civilization that had suddenly empowered in the person of Haman, a vicious mass murderer. But there was also a key difference in ancient Persia. The proto-Hitler and his allies were defeated in time. Jews today celebrate Purim not because they are bloodthirsty, but because of the tale of Esther conveys precisely this powerful lesson. Evil must be fought before it is too late. Jews read Esther annually in order to relearn that lesson. In that core respect, indeed, the book of Esther is also a source of political wisdom, and the woman who gave it her name emerges as a political pole star, and this helps explain the initially odd-seeming fact that the book is known as Esther and not as Mordecai. After all, it is Esther's cousin Mordecai who first alerts her to Haman's plans and galvanizes her into action, and it is Mordecai who at the end of the story emerges as the new vizier of Persia. Nevertheless, the book is named for Esther, and for an eminently solid reason. She, rather than he, possesses the political instincts most appropriate and most needed for the task. In this chapter, we will trace the process by which that young woman from the provinces, as it were, emerges as a queen for all seasons and a role model for Jewish statesmanship down to our own age. Along the way, I will also be citing reflections on the biblical book by my great-uncle, Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik. He was a leader of the American Jewry. Yeah. He died in 1903. Upon whose deep wisdom we will have frequent occasion to call further in these pages. To understand Esther, the person in the book, it helps first to grasp the significance of Shushan, the geographic locale where her story unfolds. It is known in the text as Shushan the Birah, often translated as Shushan the capital, Susa in English. But that is not quite right. The municipality is referred to rather as the city of Ir or of Shushan. What then is the proper meaning of Birah? A clue is provided by the word usage elsewhere in the Bible, where it indicates specifically the temple in Jerusalem, the edifice towards which the entire city turns its gaze. Analogously, Birah in Esther refers not to the city, but to the royal palace, its complex of magnificent buildings and gathering places, and the hordes of grasping ministers and courtiers who populate its halls. As at Hampton Court Palace in the reign of King Henry VIII, or at Versailles in the time of Cardinal Richelieu, it is within the dynamics of this ancient seat of power, complete with its swirling mix of ambition, intrigue, and scheming, and anti-Semitism, that the Jewish queen will be compelled to make her way and exercise her will. The opening of the book of Esther paints a picture of the palace and its environs and the king emperor Ahasuerus, who, we are informed, reigns over a vast swath of the earth. When we meet him, he is engaged in a lavish and hedonistic celebration of himself. What is he like? The Talmud asks whether the monarch whom we meet in this opening scene is a wise man or a fool. The answer would appear to be both. An idiot would not be exercising total power over an empire. And if, as seems likely, the book's Ahasuerus is to be identified with the historical King Xerxes the First, then he was a ruler of astonishing power indeed, albeit one with capacity for catastrophically foolish decisions. Indeed, a good historical parallel to Ahasuerus might be the aforementioned English King Henry VIII, a monarch of enduring influence whose seizures of paranoid rage were ignited whenever a courier let him down or when lust for a woman led him to rash actions, and their invariably disastrous consequences. Having relied on Cardinal Wolsey for every aspect of his regime, Henry tossed that loyal servant aside for failing to secure a papal annulment of the king's marriage to Queen Catherine, famous for his defense of the Catholic faith. He abruptly changed both his mind and his religious affiliations as soon as Anne Boleyn appeared on the scene. Ahasuerus is similarly brilliant, but mercurial, with one additional element. It is when drunk that his profound paranoia and unchecked rage make themselves manifest. Some statesmen, Winston Churchill being an eminent example, have succeeded despite or perhaps even with the help of their penchant for drink. But this king of ancient Persia is not one of them. What emerges when he indulges is a terrifying propensity for megalomania and the rapid-fire issuing of wildly unconsidered edicts, each of which is to be carried out immediately and without question. Exhibit A. Toward the end of a week-long banquet with which the book of Esther opens is Ahasuerus' drunken demand that Vashti, his queen, appear so that his lecherous courtiers might gaze upon her beauty. When she refuses, he promptly orders that she be put aside, which could very well have meant her execution. Only after his fury subsides does he realize how hastily he has acted. For now he needs a new wife. An empire-wide beauty contest is thereupon instituted that, for the meticulous attention paid to each young woman's preparation, 6 months with oil of myrrh, another 6 months with perfume and cosmetics, is fully the match of anything dreamed up for consumption by today's reality TV. In this horrific reality show, woman after woman is brought to the king until he discovers the one whom he truly desires. Esther, the winner of the contest, comes from a family of Jews who are introduced in these words. That's if you're not familiar with the story of Esther. This has given us a good background. Ish Yehudi Haya B'Shushan Habirah. There was a Jew in the court of Shushan, and his name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, son of Shimi, of the family of Kish, who was exiled from Jerusalem with the king Jeconiah at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And he raised Hadassah, also named Esther, his first cousin. Today's reader can have little idea of how shocking these words were when written or what deep complexities they reveal. On the one hand, Mordecai is a Jew, but not only a Jew, he was also a descendant of Kish, the family of King Saul. And not only that, but as we are further informed, Mordecai's family were among the exiles taken captive by the Mesopotamian emperor Nebuchadnezzar, who just a decade before his conquest of Jerusalem and ravaging of the first temple in 586 had succeeded in removing to Babylon all of the city's elite figures, including the king. In other words, Mordecai comes from a family of Jewish leaders, a family once esteemed in the Jewish capital. That is, on the one hand, on the other hand, in Babylonia, the Jewish exiles would become so culturally assimilated as to have taken on not only local attire and mannerisms, but most startlingly, local names like, for example, Mordecai and Esther. A visitor to Pergamon Museum in Berlin today can gaze upon the reconstructed gate of King Nebuchadnezzar. It is known as the Ishtar Gate, named after the Babylonian goddess Ishtar and dedicated to the Babylonian god Marduk. Ishtar and Marduk, in the course of time and in their Hebraic derivatives, as Esther and Mordecai, these would indeed become Jewish names. But a classical reader of the book of Esther could not help being taken aback by the association of its two Jewish heroes with names linked to pagan deities. The statement that there was a Jew in the courts at Shushan and his name was Mordecai would in itself raise the question as to where this person's true identity might lie. Such initial doubts could only have been reinforced by the tale's historical context. The action takes place long after Nebuchadnezzar's sack of Jerusalem and quite some time after the Persian Emperor Cyrus has in turn conquered the Babylonians and allowed the exiled Jews to return to their homeland. By the reign of King Ahasuerus in Persia, the destroyed temple will have already been rebuilt in Jerusalem. Therefore, Jews who are still part of the Persian Empire have chosen not to return to the Holy Land, but instead to remain in their comfortable diaspora existence. About Mordecai, this highlights a hard truth and raises another question. Unlike his ancestors who had served God in his temple in Jerusalem, he had chosen to serve Ahasuerus in Shushan. We are thus again compelled to ask, just how assimilated is he? At least Mordecai is known by the Gentiles at court to be the court's Jew, but the same cannot be said for his first cousin, who has been brought before Ahasuerus. Her Hebrew name, Hadassah, is never divulged by her, neither is the fact of her Jewishness or familiar link to Mordecai. Upon her encounter with the king, she is immediately selected as queen. Why? She is indeed beautiful, but surely out of the empire's millions of women, others must be as fair. It is thus reasonable to assume that her success in the king's reality show must be attributed to something even more alluring than her looks. What we discover in Esther is another capacity, an elusive quality described by the Bible as the ability to find favor in the eyes of all who encounter her. In his commentary on the book, Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik describes this quality as charm, inner strength, and divine charisma. Today it would be known as emotional intelligence, the ability to read any situation in which one finds oneself and to respond accordingly. And indeed, as we shall see, this quality, combined at first with her non-identification as a Jew, is what will enable Esther, when a mortal threat to her people suddenly looms into view, to fulfill her Jewish destiny and to give the world the first example of diaspora statesmanship. You know what? I think that's probably a good spot to stop for today. I hope you're enjoying this out there. Unless you guys give me a suggestion of what you want to hear, I'm going to try to find something I think flows with what we've been reading that's fresh and unique. Hopefully you're enjoying it, and hopefully you'll enjoy me or rejoin me tomorrow for some more of this Providence and Power, 10 Portraits in Jewish Statesmanship. I enjoyed his excerpt on King David, which I'm sure entire books could be written about, but to put it together in a simplified chapter and get to the point of the matter relevant to statesmanship, what is the quality of leadership for sure, profound, and I'm sure this chapter on Esther will be just as motivating as well. So please join me tomorrow, and we will continue with more out of this Providence and Power by Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. And we'll be back tomorrow, same time. Till then, have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody. Bye for now.